Hello, I'm Michael Pisaro. I'm a composer from Los Angeles, and I'm here in Melbourne for the Melbourne Festival, presenting my own piece, A Wave in Waves, for 100 Percussion.
I'm Greg Stuart. I'm a percussionist from South Carolina and am here along with Michael for the Melbourne Festival presentation of A Wave in Waves.
So we will actually talk a bit about that piece. Hopefully you'll find ways of hearing it online, or maybe watching documentation, or hearing the piece in performance. But this video is to talk a bit about composition, my approach to composition, our work together. And I think a good place to start, if you had a chance to watch the other video, you'll see that we are working with, you might call, non-traditional instruments that have a range of sound from pure noise, more or less, to fairly pure pitch. And the thing about that, I think about that as a composer, is that most of the history of Western classical music is actually about pure sounding pitches. And concert halls are built to make them audible, pianos are built to make them audible. That's often what we think music is. As some of you may know, within the world of contemporary music, or the kind of music that we make, experimental music, this began to feel like it changed decisively actually before Greg and I were born, in the mid-1950s with the work of John Cage, who became known for using essentially everything in music that had not been allowed to that point as the basis of music. For some people, that's no music at all, but for people like Greg and I, that at some point in our lives became incredibly exciting. So that spectrum from noise to pitch is essentially the spectrum of the sound of the world. So if we just take a moment or so here to just listen to our environment, we'll hear some of all of that. So this is a nice large room, used to be a meat plant in the middle of the city, and so when I'm sitting here listening, I'm hearing all kinds of automobile and truck traffic going by. I'm hearing the echo of the space, and in a sense, when I talk louder, you can hear how large the space is. I'm also hearing the cars honking. Even the sound of my own voice is pitched. So we're immersed in a world that covers this spectrum all the time. And I guess I think that music, Western music especially, was formed in opposition to that. So the reason why we have so predominantly pitched instruments is that singers or pianists or violin or oboe, they all stand out a lot against that environment. For me, the implications of that are really interesting. And I had to think, when I was in high school, why does music feel like it's in opposition to the environment? What does that actually mean, that the work I want to do has to be separated from the world in which I live, both sonically and otherwise? And I just felt, as other people sometimes do, that there was something, for me at least, that didn't make sense about that. I was interested in things that to me reflected more the world in which I lived. And so in a sonic way, that meant thinking about using the kinds of instruments, ultimately it meant thinking about using the kind of instruments that we make. I don't know, how did you get into this way of thinking about music, or working with this?
Working with these kinds of sounds, like perhaps some of you, I started playing an instrument when I was young, so 10 years old, and it was a process to come to this kind of music. But over the years, I found myself veering more and more towards things which on the surface might not be immediately described as being musical. So embodying some of the qualities that Michael was talking about a second ago, where you might have a musical situation which, instead of involving tones which effectively stand out and are privileged against a background, you have something which is much more a kind of fluid continuum between tone and noise. And that was a kind of ripe area for consideration as a percussionist. Percussion is often sometimes thought of as being a kind of noisy part of, for example, the orchestra. But sometimes in that particular formation, the noise is sort of controlled by...
it's reined in by pitch.
It's reined in by pitch, or sort of confined in that structure, as opposed to being able to kind of spread out. So it was a kind of pathway that I found as a percussion player, getting into things that on the surface didn't seem to have musical qualities, but embodied qualities that would allow me to hear things that I hadn't previously considered as musical, and that necessarily precipitated an entirely different way of thinking about being a percussion player.
I mean, one thing that is clear probably already is that Greg and I work together. So another aspect of how we make music is that it's, you know, if you've studied classical music, sort of historically speaking, you come to know Beethoven or Bach or Brahms or Debussy as a composer, and if we're very lucky, we might have some sense of who the performer was that they worked with, but seldom do we get the sense that the performer they're working with really shaped the music they made.
Right. Or sometimes even we start to think of the score itself as being the piece. You know, that is the object that is primary.
And so the way Greg and I work together is we don't have these sort of very clearly defined roles of what it means to be a composer, what it means to be a performer, but we know that when it comes down to it, if I need somebody to perfectly bow a bell, that's probably not going to be me, because I haven't spent the hours doing it that Greg has, but he has. But when it comes to crunching all kinds of numbers to arrive at a musical form, then that's more likely to be me, because I've spent so much time doing that. But in a sense, we make music as a collaboration in which either of us can suggest compositional ideas, either of us can either perform or demonstrate what the performing instruments will be. And I actually think that this is fairly true to the way most of the world makes music.
Right.
So coming back to the topic we started with, which has to do with how does Western music fit into the world, this is slightly different, but it's related in the sense that a lot of times we don't think so clearly about the difference between composer and performer when we're playing Zimbabwean music, for instance.
Right. Yeah, so in our collaboration, our roles sort of tend towards certain things, or it's like you have these two poles, and at the limit, Michael writes the music and I perform it. But between that, it's just as likely that he may be making some suggestions, even after a score is written, as to how something might be played, whereas I might be making suggestions for how to structure a piece. They're just as likely.
So what we demonstrated here was a set of instruments, as I said, that move from noise to pitch. And the question was, to come back to something raised in the first video, so how does one make a composition from all those sounds? They're interesting and beautiful on their own, but one thing that seems to be true for music, no matter what your definition is that it will have some sort of structure. Even apparently non-structured events can be revealed to have structures. So that's more or less the challenge of a piece that uses those sets of instruments. If we say a lot of classical music has got a melodic structure or thematic or harmonic It has phrase structures. These are all the sentences and the sort of grammatic details that make it seem comprehensible. But they're based on, as most of you know, precise tonal relationships between those elements. What's clear when you have these instruments is that you can't think that way about them because they're not going to operate that way. They're not going to be as predictable in terms of their tonal content. So within this spectrum, it becomes a question of how is the sound shaped. So one thing we didn't really demonstrate, but which is a feature of this music, is that the sounds have a duration and they come and go in a way that gives you the feeling, in the case of a wave and waves, in the first part, like you're in a single wave. Again, coming back to kind of the one of the things that we find in nature, that is the movement from something very quiet to something relatively loud, again back to something quiet over a long duration, but one that's proportioned about the way a wave would be proportioned.
Right.
And so the set of instruments used, there are 100 such instruments, all different, becomes greater as the piece progresses. So that's one way of thinking about a musical structure, not just where does it move harmonically or tonally, but in a sense, how big is it?
Right. Yeah, so one of the really interesting questions that Michael is sort of having to deal with in writing a piece for such a collection is, since the relationships between, a metal bowl full of pebbles and a bowed bell and a bowed woodblock and so on and so forth are undefined, what does one do? There's not a kind of standard template in which to plug all of those things in. So it becomes a real question of thinking of how to structure it. So maybe I would ask you, you talked about the first part being a wave. Why that? Why not some other kind of phenomena? Was there anything else that you imported or used as a kind of reference point for this work to sculpt it?
Yeah, there are two things. Very briefly, really like a lot of composers, a lot of my interest is in art generally, not just music. And in this case, I was very influenced by a poem by the American poet John Ashbery called "O Wave." And it picks up a little bit on something we talked about in the last video. This poem has to do with an event, or it's about the idea of an event. And Ashbery, it's a poem, it reads like poetry, but there's a kind of philosophical weight to it that wants to ask the question, how do events occur? And John Ashbery's surprising answer is that we don't know. We think we know. We know in retrospect that something happened, but in the midst of something, we're not aware that it's occurring to us. In other words, it's about how humans are present in a way, but also they only ever recapture things they've experienced. We have experiences, but so much of our experience is either delayed by how long it takes to hear and see, which is not a long time, but it is a difference between the rate at which things actually happen, and also how things feel to us. So what's important to me might take a long time for me to feel that it was important, even while it's happening. And so this poem is about that. It's about something that will have been important to you, but you only really felt it afterwards. And Ashbery's word for this is not event, it's wave. And so the implication is that the beginnings of a feeling happen before you know them. And at some point it'll dawn on you, you feel something, a change in temperature or it's raining, but the sources of that have occurred before you even felt them. And the same is true for what happens afterwards. I don't know the exact moment it stops raining. I know when I maybe am conscious that it stops raining, but I can't even tell you when the last drop occurred, because in fact I don't know that. And so that's the structure, that was the thinking behind the structure, was that I wanted to try to draw out and in a way sort of simulate that feeling as a wave.
Right. So in this piece, you're not only tapping into all the things you were talking about with like the sound of the world, but you're also tapping into another art form as a kind of model for a way to think about a piece, something that's, you know, kind of external to quote unquote music.
Right. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's interesting about this kind of work is that actually you don't ever really know what the boundaries are. So that's, I think, maybe already clear when we talk about the boundary between environmental sound and music. That's something we construct. And the moment that you hear an instrument that consists of, say, pebbles in a metal bowl, you're hearing something that actually you could hear on the street or on a beach or something like that. And so it's already got that kind of boundary principle to it. Right. And I think that's true for just about everything we've talked about.
Right. You were talking about construction and putting things together. Maybe we should just talk a little bit about the kind of early phases of constructing a Wave and Waves as a collaboration between us with respect to recording, right? We're here for the concert, of course, but the concert would not be happening had there not been work that we had done to create a Wave and Waves as, you know, a piece of music.
Right. I think that's a really good thing to talk about before we stop, which is, you know, being conscious that many of you might want to compose, but you don't happen to have 100 instruments or people at your disposal. Right. How would you go about working with sounds that are non-traditional, and how would you make compositions out of them if you don't have the resources to, or you don't have the willingness on the part of other musicians to work on them? And as has been the case for at least the last 50 years, often people who have these kinds of compositional ideas work with the medium of recording. And it's easier now than it's ever been. I mean, you can get, as you probably know, fairly good recorders on your phone. If you're lucky enough to have a portable phone, you can even start that way. But that's how we began. So when we had the idea for this composition, neither Greg or I thought we were going to find 100 musicians to play it. But we did know that Greg could play all the instruments and had access to recording equipment.
Right. So after having conversations with Michael about what the piece would be, what the instrumentation would be, I set to work to record all of the 100 parts one at a time. And the equipment that I had to do that was not super sophisticated. I wasn't working in a professional recording studio, but was just using my laptop, a very low-end sound card, and a single condenser microphone, and sort of went to work recording all of the individual sounds, sort of like samples that you would need to construct a recording of this piece, and recorded all of the sounds one at a time. And then it was a project of editing and mixing and putting all of those sounds in the right place where they belonged according to the score. So that was a real work of construction, one sound at a time, until all of the sounds were there, and then mixing and mastering until we had a completed recording.
And I would suggest, it's an amazing amount of work that Greg did, but I would suggest that actually this is a good way to start writing music, if any of you are interested in doing
Composer, performer.
Yeah. Find people to work with and start recording.